Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Justin Russell. I am the Principal Director of the New York Center for Foreign Policy Affairs, and this is the latest installment in our webinar series. Today, we're going to be talking with experts and having an open discussion about the U.S. policy and international affairs involving the newest frontier in global relations, that being the Arctic. We are very fortunate today to have joining us for this discussion Agnes Sipinskaite. She recently completed a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship at the Finnish Institute of International Affairs in Helsinki and is the Stiftung Wesenkraft and Politik in Berlin. During the fellowship, she focused on security issues in the Arctic, including a security dilemma in the region, policies of the Arctic and non-Arctic states, and the rights of indigenous people. Her research has been published in both in-house policy briefings and external articles in the Arctic Yearbook and the Arctic Institute. Agnes, thank you for joining us. Next, we have Dr. Michael Paul. Dr. Michael Paul is a senior fellow with the International Security Division of Stiftung Wesenkraft und Politik in Berlin. Since 1995, project director of the Armed Forces Dialogue in cooperation with the German Ministry of Defense. He's a member of the Arctic Dialogue and a member of the expert team on maritime security of the German government. He's published extensively about the Arctic region, arms control, international security, maritime security, and nuclear strategy. He's currently writing several policy papers concerning Russia's Arctic policy, which is forthcoming, Arctic national strategies, military security, and a book about geopolitics and the security in the Arctic. Michael, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for inviting me.
And also joining us is Nick Solheim. He is the founder of the Wallace Institute for Arctic Security, an advocacy group dedicated to ensuring a free and fair Arctic for future generations by advocating for peaceful resolutions to many of the challenges facing the region and the surrounding nations today. Nick, again, thank you for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
There's no question that the Arctic has become the centerpiece of foreign policy for most countries globally, but more specifically, most countries in the Northern Hemisphere. The implications involving international commerce, economic security, national security, defense, and environmental protection are infinite. This new arena creates foreign policy challenges, not only for the United States, but for many of its allies, and in some instances, several of its adversaries. And that's what we hope to discuss today. Let's get it kicked off. First of all, I want to start off and Michael, I'll go to you first on this one. The Arctic, for many years, it was just this frozen tundra that largely was mentioned in secondary or tertiary conversations involving commerce and security. Kind of give us a little bit of a pitch about why that has changed and how the Arctic became so important. Michael?
Okay, sorry, I didn't understand that the question was to me. Okay, yeah, much has changed. Climate change has pretty much changed the perception and the attitudes towards the Arctic because right now, because of climate change and receding sea ice, it is possible to both use sea routes through the Arctic, and especially the Northern Sea route along Russian coastline. And in 2007, Russia started to get more excited about the Russian.
Sorry? Do you not have a middle name?
So there's a double effect here. Okay, in 2007, Russia started a polar expedition, planting a flag on the North Pole seabed, and by that event, everybody in the world talked about a new gold rush in the Arctic and a new struggle for the Arctic. So unfortunately, right now we are back in more pragmatic and pragmatic waters, so to say, more pragmatic politics towards the Arctic. Also, the Russian remilitarization of the Arctic is a topic we will talk about, I guess, in the next hour or so. I don't hear anything.
I cannot hear anything either.
I apologize. The world of Zoom continues to be a challenge for everybody. I want to go to you, and going off of what Michael was saying, when we look at the recent advent of the importance of the Arctic in national policies throughout the Northern Hemisphere, it seems to me that it is so new that many of what we would look at as superpowers in the Northern Hemisphere seem challenged by how to implement their strategies and policies in the Arctic. Why is it so challenging to these big players, and why should the Arctic be so important?
That is a very broad question. It's quite a few things to unpack there. I think because what Michal talked about here, a lot has been changing. So it's difficult to make sense of it and figure out the role that each country should play there and what position they should have. But also there is an issue of resources to be allocated to implementation of Arctic policies once the country or organization like the European Union, for instance, has it. So it's a lot to figure out within a short period of time, and I think that's why countries are struggling with figuring out, and not only countries, but like I said, the European Union, the NATO as well.
Very good. I want to go to Nick on this next question. Nick, I mean, the large players, when we talk about the Arctic, we kind of assume that the usual gang of superpowers, that being Russia, China, the United States, seem to be, at least in theory, the largest players with the largest interests, when in fact, we look at other nations, the Nordic nations of Norway, Sweden, we look at Canada's strong interest. Is it correct to assume that the United States is kind of now, because of its lack of focus in the Arctic, a secondary player in Arctic policy and Arctic affairs?
Yeah, as the resident American on the panel, I would say that that's probably not a fair or accurate representation of our stance. Listen, it's been it's been a tough couple decades, shall we say, for funding for research and defense in the American Arctic. But I think over the last 5 or 6 years, I think we've certainly seen an increase in interest, not just from the Department of Defense, but also from the Department of Energy, the Trump administration was particularly interested in this. I worked with them quite frequently on, like, how do we, close the Polish security cutter gap? How do we, collaborate with our allies in NATO to, ensure that the Arctic is a safe place for Arctic nations to operate. I know that the State Department in particular was very concerned about the movements that China is making in the Arctic region, and they continue to do so under the Biden administration, by the way. So, even though there's been a lack of action, which I would, largely attribute to Congress and its kind of ever increasing delegation of authority, being the power of the purse for the United States, there is actually a very high levels of power, interest in the Arctic region, interest in investing in the Arctic, not just on science, research, defense, but also there are about 20,000 people that live in the American Arctic and Alaska. And that's, those people are American citizens too. It's important for us to invest in them. And I think I've seen a fair amount of interest over the last 5 or 6 years in doing so. So I think it's taking a little while to get to where we want to be, but I do see it as happening. And I think the Chinese probably should be a little scared about everything that we're going to be setting up in the region.
If I can just chip in here, I completely agree with that. And there have been clear examples of the U.S. More expressed interest in the Arctic. Just last week, perhaps you're aware of that as well, that the U.S. Army released its own Arctic strategy. About a month ago, the U.S. deployed its bombers for the first time in Norway. So there are clear examples of U.S. more explicitly express interest in the Arctic.
But Michael, is that the perception that our international partners have, or is it in fact largely viewed as the United States has a bigger fish to fry, the Arctic isn't a priority? Is that the perception that we're seeing in our NATO allies?
I guess after 4 years of undermining allies and partners, the United States needs to reestablish its international leadership role. So the Arctic is an excellent opportunity to stress the value of this approach, but it's a matter of time and priorities, as you mentioned, of the Biden foreign policy agenda. And we have to remember that the Arctic always has been a quite neglected area of US foreign policy. And now domestic issues are much more important. And looking back to the meeting with the Chinese last week, we have to say that in less than 100 days of his administration, President Biden got a taste of what the next 4 years may look like. A new era of bitter superpower competition, marked by perhaps the worst relationship Washington has had with Moscow since the fall of the Berlin Wall, and with Beijing since it opened diplomatic relations with the United States. I just learned about the interim National Security Strategic Guidance paper, and I was really surprised that the Biden administration has published something like that already. So the United States is back at the table, but it will take its time till the Arctic will be a topic on the table.
Let me, if I could follow up with that, Michael, is the U.S. policy contingent on the other allies that are members of the Arctic Council? Or I guess the better question is, what is it going to take for the U.S. to take the leadership role within the Arctic Council and on policy to keep it relevant and drive that kind of policy?
I guess my feeling is that John Kerry will be one of the companions of Blinken when they will meet at Reykjavik in May. And when they are I would say it would be a good idea to put climate change on the agenda, because the United States could be a clear leader in that, and everybody is interested in organizing climate responsible technologies right now, and green technologies. And so it was already on the agenda of the Obama administration, as you remember. And it is now, I guess, it would be a good idea to meet at a ministerial meeting at Reykjavik in May, when Russia will become chair of the Arctic Council, to talk about climate change, which was neglected by the Trump administration, and which is in part responsible for the role the United States right now has, or has used to have, in the Arctic Council before the Trump administration.
Nick, do you agree?
Excuse me?
To Nick Solheim, do you agree?
Yeah. So, going back to the beginning of his point, there's been a lot of salacious media coverage about, President Trump's relationships with other countries, and with the leaders of those countries, and I think there's some truth to a lot of those things, but the fact remains, President Trump, for all his faults, of which there are many, directed the agencies under him to focus a lot more on the Arctic region than any president has in probably 30 to 40 years. He was seriously interested, and I know this from having conversations with people in the administration. He was seriously interested in closing the icebreaker gap. He was the impetus behind giving $12.1 million to Greenland, and working with the government of Greenland to ensure that their economy is stable from Chinese influence. These are things that he was seriously interested in. It was not, like, oh, Trump's going to buy Greenland and that was it. I mean, there were very serious, very smart and capable people who have worked in the federal government for decades, who finally had an opportunity to get a seat at the table and, work on some serious investment in Arctic policy from an American perspective. Now, it's really important to have like a long-term view of these things. Stuff like this doesn't happen overnight. So there's still a lot of work to be done. I think it would be a mistake to count the U.S. out of foreign policy. I've heard some encouraging things from the Biden administration as well, and I'm looking forward to seeing what they're able to put forward.
But Nick, I'd like to follow up with you on that line and just for full disclosure, I'm a former member of the United States Coast Guard. I've been around Coast Guard and maritime security policy for the better part of about 30 plus years. It seems to me when we talk about U.S. policy in the Arctic, there's almost a double standard. You look at the funding for the Coast Guard. You talked about the icebreaker gap. The Congress has literally been begging the Coast Guard to take funding for modernization on the icebreakers, as well as building new icebreaking hulls. But for decades, they would push back, saying, "No, we're okay with what we've got. We've got Polar Sea, Polar Star, and we'll use that." Is there a double talk going on as far as what we put out publicly and what the reality of this of the policy standards are?
Yeah, I mean, I don't particularly see that being the case. Prior to COVID, I was meeting with these people from the Coast Guard who were going and making appropriations requests on the Hill. I was talking to these folks all the time, and their most recent request as of last year was that to fulfill the bare minimum of the Coast Guard's needs, or basically for like what they need to do to operate in the Arctic and Antarctic regions, they needed somewhere between 5 to 7 polar security cutters. Now, they didn't all need to be heavies. They said that they could probably do with a mix of half heavy, half medium. But this is certainly something that they've been requesting for the last couple of years. Now, I do want to say here that Arctic policy is not just polar security cutters. That's not, it's the thing that gets talked about a lot here in DC. It's what the president himself talked about a lot, when relating to Arctic policy, because it's tangible. It's something that's easy for people who don't know a lot about this Arctic stuff to grab a hold of and say, oh yes, like we should fund that program. A lot of the things that, the United States needs to be doing on Arctic policy are a lot more complicated than that. So the way that I kind of view, again, having a long-term historical view of American policy in the Arctic is I view the last, 4 to 5 years or 4 to 6 years really as kind of trying to build some groundwork so that, the Biden administration and whoever is, president after Joe Biden, will have kind of a solid foundation to build an American Arctic policy on.
Okay. And Nick, I do want to come back to that, but I also want to look at the other superpower players that are involved in that. And Anya, I'd like to go to you. When we looked at Russia and China, I mean, they're known adversaries, both with each other and with U.S. policies in many instances. They seem to have an advantage that they're fighting each other, and the U.S. needs to be concerned about in the Arctic region. Considering that a lot of our allies have expressed primary interest about the presence of Russia and China in the Arctic and in Arctic policy, is this something that in your opinion, the Biden administration looks at as a key facet to both economic and national security policy?
I think that, first of all, it's probably way too early to judge Biden's administration because it's barely been just over 2 months.
Right. Let me rephrase that if I could, Anya. Are the indicators there that, with the important role that Secretary Kerry is going to play, the fact that Secretary Blinken has made it a point to put some focus, are the indicators there that this is now becoming a primary point?
I wouldn't go as far as to say that it's becoming a primary point, but I think there have been definitely signs, such as even, for instance, perhaps I'm speculating, but the meeting in Alaska, of all places, why? And I think so far, really, especially given, again, I would like to maybe emphasize the point that I made before, that it all comes down to resources too. So there are restrictions there, and particularly amid the pandemic. So there are policy priorities, and maybe the Arctic is not thus far important enough to allocate those resources there. So in my view, I think Biden administration so far, and again, it's very hard to judge it given that it hasn't even been 100 days. I think they have shown more interest than the previous administrations have.
Okay. Michael, I want to go to the question on China involvement. China, correct me if I'm wrong, China is still not a member of the Arctic Council. Is that correct?
It's an observer.
So talking about China's involvement, correct me if I'm wrong, China is still not a member of the Arctic Council. Is that correct?
It's a permanent observer of the Arctic Council. It's not a member.
But being the fact that they've put a lot of and expressed a lot of interest and that they struggle with the U.S. over issues involving Greenland and Iceland. Do you think that, well, how do you think that the U.S. will or should respond to China as a permanent observer on the Arctic Council, and how it relates with the relationship between Beijing and Washington right now?
And Russia.
And correct.
Yeah, it's a triangle. You have to think about a triangle in that respect.
Can you elaborate on that? I'd be interested to have you elaborate on that triangle, the Russian, China, U.S. triangle as it relates to the Arctic.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, the Biden administration really needs to master an Arctic where, on the one hand, cooperation with Putin's Russia is a geographic necessity, and confrontation with China is a future policy option. So it's quite a unique situation where you have to cooperate with a killer and to confront a climate partner. So it's really a very complex situation, because you need both Russia and China as partners with respect to climate action and with respect to pragmatic situations like search and rescue. You know pretty well, much better about that than I do, as a former Coast Guard man. And so most people who are in the think tanks involved about China and Russia wonder which pace China-Russia cooperation will take in the next years. I always made the point that it's a very pragmatic relationship. It's not an alliance. It will not become so to say a defense alliance or that. But we have to, for Russia, it's a very difficult situation because it's already right now in a junior position, and with China becoming a maritime power with astonishing expeditionary capabilities, and right now even a PLA Navy, which is in numbers bigger than the US Navy with its global tasks. It's really, I guess, something frightening for the Russians, because when we see the more and more melting sea ice in the Arctic, I guess the Chinese will make the Arctic and the Arctic sea routes part of the Belt and Road Initiative, and will leave the Russians the rest, so to say. So much of the hope of Russia, of Chinese money and capital investing in the Northern Sea route is, I guess, a question of time, as long as there is not the alternative via the North Pole, the transpolar route, which would mean that you are navigating in international waters and are free of Russian support. So it's we could
make a subject. We could do a subject just on the EEZ implications of the Arctic all day. I agree with you, Nick. I want to follow up with you on this next question, because we do talk about the Arctic. The Arctic shipping routes. Obviously, a big component of the Trump administration was the energy independence, which would involve the North Slope of Alaska. How delicate is the balance between the factors of economic and commercial interests versus the national security interests of the Arctic? And are those viewed as mutually exclusive by the U.S.?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. I would say, for myself personally, and I think this was kind of the view of the Trump administration, is that those two were very tightly intertwined. Economics and we saw this play out on a broader scale with the trade war between the United States and China. I mean, the administration viewed China both as a military and an economic threat. And that sort of policy definitely came into play, when determining Arctic policy as well. It's why, Secretary Pompeo was so concerned, with the Chinese offer for investment in airfields in exchange for rare earth mineral mining rights in Greenland. That was a pretty big concern for the United States. Having Chinese economic involvement so close to American shores. It's also why, I know that the State Department was very concerned about Shandong Mining's bid to take over that, oh my gosh, I'm blanking on the name of it right now, but that gold mine in Canada, which,
Correct.
Ended up going, under federal review. And I think Trudeau ended up denying their application to take over that mine. Yes, these issues I think were deeply intertwined in the Trump administration for sure. To echo another point made by another panelist, I generally agree that I think it's too early to judge the Biden administration on this. The energy independence bit is going to be a bit complicated, especially with Biden's kind of basically his commitment to cleaner energy than oil and natural gas. It is possible. It just will probably be a lot more expensive and take a lot longer to become energy independent, utilizing green energy technology. So I think it's probably a bit more of a difficult sell and difficult to actually accomplish. But I haven't really seen anything that's made me think that Biden's going to be soft on China, contrary to, his comment last year that he didn't believe China was going to eat our lunch. He seems to have appointed actually and brought into his administration several economic China hawks, which I generally think is a great thing. I think both parties should be concerned with the rise of China and especially in the Arctic region. Now, as it relates to their permanent observer status, it's unfortunate that the Arctic Council granted them that, but they're there as an observer. Fine, observe all you want, but to echo former Secretary Pompeo, China is not an Arctic country, and I do not believe that they should have a seat at the table making these decisions about the Arctic and its security.
Anya, I want to go to you. Similar question. Go ahead, please.
Just the last sentence that you said, I believe that the US government actually explicitly challenged and contested China's statement that it's a near Arctic state in the DoD strategy. Mm-hmm. So yeah, that was one thing that I was thinking about. But also I was thinking about the European Union, which is, well, we haven't really mentioned that so far. And several Arctic states are in the European Union. And there have been developments over the last week concerning Chinese investment. So after 7 years of negotiations, China and the European Commission managed to reach investment agreement at the end of last year, which is yet to be ratified by the European Parliament. And because of this sanctions ordeal now, which, reciprocal sanctions concerning human rights violations in China.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, let me jump in real quick because I want to follow up with a topic that you just brought up. Okay. Is the involvement of the European Union, which obviously represents the interests of all EU members, not just the Arctic Council states.
Yeah.
Does the EU pose a positive or negative influence in the question of the Arctic? I guess the question is there a possible conflict between the individual EU member states that are in the Arctic and the overall EU strategy?
Well, first of all, again, that's a very broad question, and the EU does not yet have released or updated the strategy. They just said that they will do so this in autumn this year. So it's not entirely clear as to what the strategy is going to be. Whether it's good or bad, that's a value judgment, so I will not go on that. But talking about, well, it depends what we're talking about here, because EU is obviously doesn't have much or any impact on military issues. So if we're talking about investment, and that's what I was referring to concerning this investment agreement with China, I think that EU could, whether it will or not, that's a question, but it could have some impact. For instance, pressuring on screening mechanism, human rights issues. I personally have written a lot about indigenous people, so I find it very problematic that China government or companies related to the government are investing in critical infrastructure and so on. So I think EU could put some foot in there, but of course the EU is limited because it's ultimately each state have their own sovereignty. So it is very problematic as to how much impact it can have, but I think it should set some kind of standard, because values are not the same in China and in the European Union. The European Union stands, for instance, for human rights, and China doesn't.
Right. Michael, to you, kind of the same question is, do you foresee a possible conflict between the individual EU member states that are actually in the Arctic Council themselves and the tie-in with the EU? Could there be a conflict?
I guess that's not the problem. The problem is to get the European Union and all interested in Arctic affairs. That's the first point.
Okay.
Because myself and some European diplomats would be very, very happy if the European Union would be more interested, for example, in Greenland, and rare earth elements in Greenland. Because when EU countries and the European Union would have some projects in that area, we could be sure that there could be a sustainable economy, and that the production itself would be under circumstances which would be more compatible with the environment than in the Chinese case. So the first thing is to get the European Union more interested in the Arctic, and therefore I wrote a paper about the European Union and the Arctic. And as Agne already mentioned, we will see Arctic strategy paper, a new one, or a so-called communication about the Arctic in the I guess in the later part of the year. But right now, the diplomats in Brussels are thinking about what to write into that paper. And one of my recommendations was clearly to concentrate on maritime security. And that's the point, Justin, I don't have to sit, I have to talk about that, what that means. But clearly, as you guess knows pretty well, we have a big problem with maritime domain awareness in the Arctic and with communication and so on. And
Right.
the European Union could play a very good and beneficial role in that aspect. Also, all the nations which are engaged in the Arctic right now know about that problem. Russia, I remember, has started now to put a glass fiber communication cable along the Northern Sea route, and is planning to digitalize the Northern Sea route. It wants to, at least, it has a plan, but whether it will really put into effect, we will see. But I guess the European Union will become more involved with the years to come. And everybody knows that we have a time frame from right now. I guess it will be more interested in Arctic affairs when the sea ice, when the summer sea ice will be vanished, so to say, when we have ice-free Arctic in summertime in the 2030s, the mid-2030s. And right now, all the nations which are engaged in the Arctic have the time to prepare for that situation when the ship traffic will grow, and also the problems involved with that, and accidents and traffic, and the interest in resources will grow. And China will have a naval capacity which will play a role in the Arctic too, I'm sure.
Nick, I want to transition over to you and look at the national defense. This is a question for all three of our panelists, but Nick, I'm going to start with you. Ever since the end of the Cold War, it appears that military and national defense confrontation has become the new norm in the Arctic. Russia has just built one of the largest military installations in its modern infrastructure in the Arctic. They've got 25,000 kilometers of Arctic coastline that belongs to them. Do you think that, number one, is the Arctic region a new variation of the old Cold War? Is it the new Cold War, first of all?
Yeah, so I would say that it's a very tricky question. So I would say that, if there is a new Cold War, it is two things that the Cold War wasn't. One, it's with China and not Russia. And to echo again another panelist from earlier, I don't believe like the China and Russia thing is an alliance.
Right.
I think it's more of a like, oh, you can do something that I need, and I can do something that you need, kind of bartering basically. So I think it's with China specifically, but also I think it's not as much like accumulating just like hordes of weapons of mass destruction. It's much more of more of an economic war probably than anything. But certainly there are security aspects that play into it as well. But I don't think you see the same kind of like, we're all inching towards pressing the launch nukes here button. I don't really think it's gotten that severe yet, but there is certainly a lot of tension between the United States and China specifically. To answer your first question,
I mean, do you agree with that?
I do. I think we can maybe find some similarities, but in such as maybe, for instance, talking about icebreakers, how many icebreakers each country has and how they compete in that field. But overall, I think it's definitely overstretching to say that that there is a Cold War going on or about to happen in the Arctic, because I don't see what anybody has to gain there. So I think it's unlikely, and it's probably not even the right language to call it that.
I mean, Michael, this brings up a good point, though. To Agni's point, calling it a new Cold War might be a little overly aggressive, but at the same time, economic security, these are shipping lanes which drive economic, which drive commerce, which, 90% of the global commerce has touch points in maritime transportation. Is this a matter of transportation security, the freeness of transportation is the new mutually assured destruction aspect of the Arctic, if that makes sense?
No.
No, okay.
I guess that, Russia is, the Russian economy depends much on carbonized resources, on carbon resources and oil and gas. And when you see the growing number of LNG tankers and tankers going through the Northern Sea route, you know that the strength of Russia is its biggest weakness. And there are several research papers from the RAND Corporation, for example, who have identified this weak link, so to say, of Russia as one of the most usable weapons which could be used easily against Russia. So Russia very much depends on a stable situation in the Arctic, a peaceful cooperation, so to say. Also, it was the one who started 2007 with the remilitarization of the Arctic. But Russia is always a problem, or like Churchill always said, more than a problem. Right now, even we Germans have a very frosty relationship with Russia, but nevertheless, I don't see a new Cold War because the interdependencies are too strong, and even China will play its cards very, very in the years to come. Hopefully, much more. Much better, I guess, than it right now does with its wolf diplomacy. So we will have no new Cold War. That's a wrong historical analogy.
Okay. Going back to Russia, in the large aspect, is Russia the biggest player right now in the Arctic? And is everybody trying to catch up with Russia? Russia
is a hegemon of the Arctic. That's not my quote, but it's from a Canadian, I guess.
Right.
It has the longest coastline. It has the most resources. It's the biggest population. And some Russians even would call the North Polar the Arctic Ocean, the Russian Ocean.
Right.
And it has claimed to be so. I think as a leading Arctic power, I believe that was 2008, their first comprehensive document after the Cold War, the end of the Cold War, where it literally defined its role as leading power in the Arctic. So I guess in that sense, it probably is, because they're probably focusing much more than the other powers.
And I mean, along that same line, we talked about U.S. policy, Russia being the big player, the China influence. We can't have an Arctic discussion without talking about the influence, or if there is an influence on the European side, or on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. How influential are Norway, Finland, Sweden, and Denmark, obviously, with Greenland?
Influential on what? On the U.S. policy?
On both driving U.S. policy, but also increasing their interest and their presence and their strategies in the Arctic individually?
I'm sorry, I don't understand the question. Of their policies individually or the U.S.?
No. It's a twofold question. Is one, does Finland, Sweden, Denmark, Norway, are their interests as important, as valuable? Are they driving their own interests at the same time that they have enough influence to help drive U.S. interests? I guess how big are they as players in the Arctic is the main question.
Yeah, again, that's a very complicated question. I think in terms of how much they can impact the U.S. policy, it all depends on what both sides have to gain. So, and again, we have to separate different issues. If it's about the investment, that's one thing. If it's about military, that's another thing. So it's very difficult to answer that question. For instance, in investment-wise, I believe that countries like Norway or Finland, they would find the US as a more reliable partner than China. But then what does the US have to gain? Is there a way of reasserting itself against Chinese influence in the Arctic? So it's always give and take.
Okay. Paul, Michael, do you agree?
Yeah. I see it from, not surprisingly, I take the look from an international security aspect, and we have to see that Blinken has visited or has had conversations with all of the NATO allies in the Arctic in the last weeks, and clearly the US administration is preparing the already mentioned meeting in Reykjavik in May, and is talking with its allies. And clearly we have seen the deployment of B-1B bombers in Norway, and Denmark has much more invested in its maritime domain awareness for Greenland, for the Greenland defense and Coast Guard and their joint forces which are deployed at Nuuk. So clearly every and Finland as a neighbor of Russia clearly is interested in everything which makes its situation better prepared for deterrence of Russian aggression. So everybody is now happy to have the Americans back on board. That's the easiest explanation of the current situation. And beside that, like Agne has mentioned, every nation clearly has its own interests, its specific interests concerning to the situation the country has concerning geography and foreign policy and so on.
Yeah, we lost Nick, as I was hoping to catch him on one of the big questions that I have regarding U.S. policy, but I obviously I would like to put it, Michael, into Agne. What is the importance of Canada in the Arctic policy as it relates to driving Washington and the partnership with Washington? I'll start with you on that one.
Well, again, a big question here.
Let me put it another way.
Try to specify maybe a little bit.
Let me put it another way. I mean, we see the military cooperation with Canada in NORAD. we see the obviously very open economic cooperation with Canada. Does Ottawa help either drive, or does Ottawa help guide the U.S. in how it interacts with the Arctic?
I don't think I can answer that question, but one thing that I can say, Canada released their own strategy, also Arctic strategy. Was it last year or 2019? Right. I'm not entirely sure.
At the end of 2019, correct.
Yeah. And I read the whole document. And one thing that stood out for me in Canada's Arctic strategy, and perhaps it can make an influence on other states, again, depending on whether they have anything to gain from that. But one thing that is different in that strategy from, say, the US strategy is that there's a lot of focus on Indigenous peoples.
Right.
So it's a lot of focus on human security rather than military security. And again, it would be very speculative of me to say that there could be an influence on the U.S. Policy in this regard. But well, me as a human rights advocate always, I hope that could be the case.
Michael, from a economic security and national security aspect, the same question to you is, how much influence does Ottawa have in guiding or driving U.S. policy?
Yeah. The Biden administration right now has a problem because they stopped the so-called XL pipeline.
Right.
And Trudeau is not very happy about that, clearly. So they have a big economic problem right now. And on the same hand, they have to come together in confronting climate change, and they have the same problems with permafrost in Canada, in Alaska, and in Russia, clearly in the Russian Arctic. So we have a lot of problems right now evolving, and in the specific US-Canada perspective, they have a lot to talk about after the Trump years, which were very difficult for the Canadian government. And there is so much on the table right now. It's really horrific. When we are talking about the Biden administration, I see such a long list of candidates you have to talk about, and you have to come to strategic, really terrific and important decisions, starting from Afghanistan to North Korea to Iran and so on and so on. There's really so many conflicts right now going on, so that I fear that Canada is a very near neighbor, but it's not on the top of the list.
Very good. I got one more question for you before I go to the last question. And you brought up the question in Canada of First Nations, but overarching the Indigenous peoples in the Arctic. The rights of Indigenous peoples have never been literally a top priority in any country's strategy.
Unfortunately.
Agreed. Is there a shift or a change that is happening as a result of the Arctic that will put more importance or more focus on Indigenous people's rights versus national security, economic security?
I think it very much depends on the country.
Okay.
China does not even acknowledge that it has indigenous peoples, for instance. Not that
Right.
China is an Arctic country, but with
Right.
a stakeholder in the Arctic, so to speak. And obviously, China has no respect for human rights. Russia has been suppressing indigenous peoples because they get in the way of their infrastructural developments in the Arctic. In countries like Finland and Norway, because it's generally more space for civil society, including indigenous peoples, to speak up. And the government's approach is very different from authoritarian countries. So there I do have hope that it will improve, and it's just a matter of dialogue and discussion. But in countries such as Russia, unfortunately not.
Very good. Real quickly, the last question I have for our panelists is the issue of what does the Arctic look like in the next generation? What does the Arctic look like in 20 years, let's say? Agne, I'll start with you. What does the Arctic footprint look like globally?
Yeah, it will be a bigger one because in 20 years we will see ice-free Arctic in the summer times, and clearly shipping traffic will grow, and we will see more accidents, and we will see, I guess, still a deficit, not the infrastructure which should be which would be necessary. And hopefully we see still peaceful cooperation, because it's in the interest of everybody to keep on cooperating in the Arctic, because it will be still a very harsh and extreme situation in the Arctic. It will be not a summertime event, but it will still be the Arctic with all its problems and weather phenomena and so on. So much will change and much will stay to be the same like before.
Right. Agne, do you agree?
Actually, my first, the only word that I had to your question was melted.
That's fair. That's definitely fair.
Yeah, which will in turn open opportunities for better or worse. Then I guess, I don't know. Well, it would be again speculative to think. Well, I hope it's for better.
Right. Very good. I mean, just Michael, you brought up the energy development that could happen up there. I could do an entire hour on oil response and planning in the Arctic from my old days. But this has been a great discussion. I first of all, I want to thank Michael, Agne. Nick had to drop off due to a prior commitment, so I want to thank him, obviously, publicly, for this absolutely fascinating discussion. I really appreciate y'all taking time out and doing this webinar with us. As always, I want to thank Alyssa Bonk, our program director, for getting this set up. I want to thank our team at the New York Center for Foreign Policy Affairs. I've got to thank Kayla. Kayla, as always, you make me look smarter than I actually am on these topics, so thank you. Juliana, Lauren, Maya, Ali, the whole crew, thank you so much. I especially want to point out this topic and this focus was brought up by one of our policy fellows, Katya Moore. Katya, thank you for kickstarting this focus topic for the center, and we're going to continue to focus on Arctic issues going forward. As always, if you have any questions, you can email them to us at info@nycfpa.org. You can also subscribe to our information by viewing our social media presence on Facebook, on Instagram, and on Twitter. You can also go to our website, www.nycfpa.org. On behalf of the executive board, the staff, and the entire team at the New York Center for Foreign Policy Affairs, thank you. And we will see you soon on our next webinar series. Have a great afternoon, everybody.
Thank you very much for arranging this. Have a good night.
Thank you,
Or
guys.
evening. Time difference.
No. Are we clear, Alyssa?